We often assume that if an AI can do a job, it's just a matter of time before human labor becomes totally obsolete. But when we actually look at the economic data, it tells a completely different story. We aren't just watching a seamless handoff of work from humans to machines. Instead, what we're looking at is a highly complex, structurally constrained economic integration. Welcome to the Explainer.
So here's the core anomaly we're dealing with. Vast swaths of cognitive labor are technically completely exposed to AI, right? But the percentage that's actually cost-effective to automate? It's fractional. To put a number on it, looking specifically at computer vision-exposed labor, businesses are currently finding it economically rational to automate only about 11% of human compensation. There is a massive gap between what a system can theoretically do and what actually makes financial sense to deploy.
Let's bring this down to earth and look at a tangible human proxy. Right now, we're seeing a 16% decline in employment for entry-level data clerks, specifically those aged 22 to 25. Basically, AI is hollowing out those highly codifiable junior roles. But here's the kicker. Employment for senior analysts in those exact same fields remains completely stable. So for the workforce, this means the bottom of the ladder is being substituted while the top is actually being augmented.
All right, which brings us to the central thesis of this explainer. The transition to algorithmic labor is not a wholesale eradication of jobs. Rather, it's a structural task compression, and it is strictly bounded by hard physical limits. Specifically, this integration is capped by the escalating costs of computing, the finite limits of our power grids, and the non-negotiable reality of human liability. Simply put, deploying AI at a massive scale eventually hits a physical and financial brick wall.
Let's break down the mechanics governing this transition. First up is minimum viable scale. You see, automation requires some massive fixed costs right out of the gate, things like model fine-tuning and infrastructure. For an enterprise to actually justify replacing a human worker, their output volume has to be exceptionally large. It has to be big enough to amortize those upfront costs against the ongoing variable price of human labor. Total automation, it turns out, is rarely the cheapest equilibrium.
And this dynamic regulates exactly how we evaluate machine capabilities, driven largely by what we call the convex cost curve of inference. Getting an algorithm to a baseline functional accuracy, that's relatively cheap. Pushing it to an intermediate accuracy is going to require moderate capital. But forcing a model to near-perfect accuracy, that becomes disproportionately and quite often prohibitively expensive.
To make this a bit more concrete, think of high-altitude mountaineering. The first 80% of the ascent, you can do that with standard equipment and effort. But that final 20% to the summit demands exponentially more resources, oxygen, and capital. Because of this convex cost curve, partial automation, where machines handle that base ascent and humans step in to manage the final, highly complex summit, that remains the mathematically rational outcome.
Now, if we stress test our current displacement rates against historical benchmarks, the data is actually highly stabilizing. The Industrial Revolution caused localized rural shocks. The Digital Revolution eradicated routine clerical work. Today, AI integration is driving a highly compressed cognitive task reallocation. What we are experiencing are intense disruptions in very specific roles, rather than some unprecedented systemic spike in global aggregate unemployment.
Which brings us to the friction staircase. Think of this as a strict causal sequence. Step 1, firms inject unprecedented capital expenditures into automation. We're talking a projected $527 billion globally by 2026. Step 2, this massive injection immediately triggers localized electrical grid strain. And step 3, that strain establishes hard physical cost asymptotes. Basically, every single time the system tries to stabilize, it immediately spawns secondary friction.
Let's look at the invisible variable defining this staircase, the energy grid. Down in Texas, ERCOT is managing a $9.4 billion transmission expansion solely for data centers. In Northern Virginia, 1,500 megawatt voltage fluctuations have literally triggered emergency grid adjustments. To bypass these public utility constraints, hyperscalers are quite literally restarting nuclear reactors, like 3 Mile Island. The geographic spread of AI is strictly physically bounded by local power availability.
Now we have to address the strongest counter-hypothesis out there, the scaling hypothesis. This argues that compute efficiency will just exponentially bypass these physical limits. But empirical data actually dismantles this through what's known as the data wall. Research shows that AI advancement is transitioning to a decelerating sigmoid curve. Why? Well, we are exhausting the finite supply of high-quality, human-generated training data. In short, the AI is literally running out of new human knowledge to learn from.
We can actually prove this architectural ceiling mathematically. Just look at humanity's last exam. This is a dataset designed specifically to test peak multidisciplinary expert reasoning. The absolute most sophisticated large language models on the planet correctly answers 64.7% of the time. But they still systematically fail or hallucinate on over one-third of these highly specialized inquiries. That 35% failure rate fundamentally blocks absolute mission-critical autonomy.
So what happens if firms ignore these physical limits, aggressively pursue total automation, and try to undercut their rivals? Well, they cross what's known as the N-star threshold. This is the AI layoff trap. It calculates the absolute maximum number of competing firms a market can sustain before mass job replacement triggers a systemic collapse in consumer purchasing power.
The causal sequence of this failure mode is entirely mechanical. 1. Firms rapidly externalize their costs via human layoffs, internalizing the savings. 2. Because those displaced workers are also consumers, their lost wages permanently vanish from aggregate spending. And 3. The total addressable market contracts severely. This creates what we call ghost GDP, a state where measured economic output stays high, but the income needed for actual consumption is decimated.
Fortunately, real-world enterprise deployments are acting as a buffer against this trap. Survey data from 2026 shows that 79% of consumers strongly prefer human interaction, and 81% believe companies deploy AI strictly to save money. We saw this play out in real time when massive consumer backlash forced corporations, like Klarna for example, to initiate highly costly rehirings of human support agents after their aggressive, AI-first deployments completely failed to resolve edge cases.
Transitioning over to the physical realm, we encounter the ultimate trade-off ledger, Moravec's paradox. High-level abstract reasoning is actually surprisingly inexpensive to replicate computationally. Conversely, low-level sensorimotor skills, these unconscious physical adaptations we've honed over millions of years, demand insurmountable computational resources. This is precisely why physical robotics consistently fail in unstructured, chaotic, human-centric environments.
And even if cognitive and physical hurdles are somehow cleared, we face the unyielding blockade of the liability trap. Sure, deep learning models might demonstrate high statistical competence when reviewing contracts or diagnosing patients, but the market inextricably prices in risk absorption, accountability, and fiduciary responsibility. Algorithms simply cannot hold malpractice insurance. Therefore, preserving a human in the loop isn't just nice to have, it is a structural legal necessity.
Which brings us to O-ring automation. Economic processes require numerous sequential, highly complementary tasks. When you automate the routine, codifiable steps of a workflow, it exponentially scales the marginal value of the remaining human steps. To put it another way, by unbundling the routine work, you mathematically elevate the premium paid for human judgment, edge case resolution, and interpersonal strategy.
To prevent the systemic drop in aggregate demand we modeled earlier, the data points directly to a specific structural intervention, a Pigouvian automation tax. This is a targeted macroeconomic levy set exactly to the demand loss per automated task. It's essentially a mathematical tool designed to force corporate alignment with macroeconomic stability, ensuring that our consumption-driven model doesn't just completely break down. The data presents a definitive trajectory. If algorithmic progression meticulously strips away our mechanical and routine labor, are we prepared to restructure a societal model where our only remaining economic value is unequivocally, irreplaceably human?